This is Preparing for the Time of Trouble, Part 15. This is the conclusion of the study of Daniel 12, and when we are going to discuss the possible answers that the angel asked Jesus in this Daniel 12 prophecy, when the angel said, "How long will these things be?" Remember, this is a prophecy that spans Daniel 10, 11, and 12. It is a culmination, a final chapter, if you will, in the series of prophecies in the book of Daniel. Specifically, Daniel 12 is talking about the very end before Jesus comes. The little time of trouble when you can't buy or sell has already passed when we start reading Daniel 12, and we are into the time when every human being has made their final choice of whether they're going to choose God or take the mark of the beast. So when the angel is asking Jesus in this vision, how long will these things be? Remember, it's spanning before the beginning of Daniel 12:1. And so we need to realize that the question is spanning more than just Jacob's time of trouble. It's also spanning the little time of trouble. So let's begin. Daniel 12 is my favorite chapter in the Bible. I've done extensive studies on it, and it has been a part of the Bible that's interested me most of my adult life. I've always been intrigued, particularly with the last part of Daniel 12, because it seems like there has never been a very definitive answer of what this means, particularly the last few verses where Jesus is telling Daniel that there is a significance, a time period called the 1260 days, 1290 days, and the 1335 days. So the purpose of this portion of the Preparing for the Time of Trouble seminar series, starting at part 7 through this part 15, is to build building blocks of understanding. So when we get to this part right now, we have the tools to be able to make a solid biblical decision about what the possibilities are for the answer to the angel's question to Jesus. How long will these things be? So we're talking about last day events. We're talking about the time of trouble. We're talking about the plagues. We're talking about when you can't buy or sell. All of this that we throw together in the term the time of trouble, even though we know there are two phases of the time of trouble. Daniel 12, 9 and 10 says, "And he said, Go thy way, Daniel, for the words are closed up and sealed until the time of the end. But the wise will understand." So even though Daniel didn't understand and God told him it would be sealed, there would come a point in time when the wise would understand. Well, we're in that time because we're in the end times, and Daniel, the book of Daniel, is unsealed, and it is now understood and is helping unlock Revelation and back and forth between the two. That's what this is talking about. So we're admonished to understand. And I believe, the disclaimer is, I believe that just like God had held back knowledge about some of these prophecies that were being revealed to him in chapter 10, 11, and 12, we can see right here that Jesus told Daniel that the words are closed up and sealed up. And later in Daniel 12, Daniel was told that, you're not going to understand. Daniel said, "I don't understand. Tell me." And God said, "I'm not telling you. It's not important for you right now. It'll be revealed later." So through my life, when I have tried to understand Daniel 11 and 12, as a Seventh-day Adventist, there has been a lot of study on Bible prophecy. And many, many of the biblical prophecies, including Daniel and Revelation, have been very clear. There's been a lot of Bible answers that explain what these different prophecies mean. These prophecies handshake back and forth. They overlap, as we've seen, between these different uh, uh, prophecies between Daniel and Revelation. The Bible interprets itself. We also have the benefit of the inspired writings of the Spirit of Prophecy through Ellen White. And that adds enhancement in a Bible documentary form to help us understand even deeper what these things are talking about. But the point is, what's interesting to me is when I have studied the book of Daniel 11 and Daniel 12, there really doesn't seem to be a lot of solid answers to what it's talking about in detail. And that's the case with cross-referencing in the scripture as well as spirit of prophecies. And it appears to me that God has intentionally held back the understanding of Daniel 11 and 12 until the end times. Well, that means God says, I'm never going to do anything without revealing it to my servants, the prophets. So God didn't give this prophecy for it not to be understood, but I believe it was not to be understood until the time at which he wanted it to be understood. So when we look back the last 100 years or more, there has not, in my opinion, been a real solid answer to what this prophecy of Daniel 10, 11, 12 is talking about, especially chapter 12. I believe the time is now where God is allowing these things to be understood. And I'm going to share with you in this presentation some historical interpretation that puts this in the past, but I'm also going to show some modern day Bible scholars who believe the Bible, believe the spirit of prophecy, and will provide you with different interpretations of what the answer is that the angel asked of Jesus in the vision. How long will these things be? Let's start with Prophets and Kings, page 547. The promise is plain that special blessing will accompany the study of these prophecies. The wise will understand. Was spoken of the visions of Daniel that were to be unsealed in the latter days. The promise is, blessed is he that readeth, and they that hear the words of the prophecy, and keep these things which are written therein. So we can see from this explanation that there is this progressive revelation we talk about where God reveals things as they're needed, and that this would be in the latter days, which I believe we are in. And we will be blessed if we study and understand what the prophecies are saying. So, in Daniel 12, verse 11, we have the first installment of Jesus explaining the answer to the question, how long will these things be, that the angel asked. And that is, because the question is how long. It is a question of timing. So here's the first timing. It shall be, verse 11, it shall be for a time, times and a half. Well, we know that means 3.5 years. And if you translate that to days, that's 1,260 days, because the Jewish calendar had 30 days in each month. It's simple math. So it shall be for a time, times and a half, and when he shall have accomplished to scatter the power of the holy people, all these things will be finished. So here's installment number 1 to answer the question, how long will these be? The first answer is 1,260 days, according to Daniel 12:11. Daniel 12:11 continues and says, gives the second installment, and from the time that the daily sacrifice is taken away, and the abomination that maketh desolate set up, there shall be 1,290 days. So we have 1,260 days and we have 1,290 days. Now he continues. Jesus is explaining the answer to the question, how long? Again, with a third answer. Daniel 12:12. Blessed is he that waiteth and cometh to the 1,305 and 30 days. So there's 1335 days. Now, during the Millerite movement of the early 1800s, the Millerite movement was when people from all denominations believed the preaching of William Miller, and that was that Jesus was going to return in 1844. Originally, they said 1843, and then 1844. So here's an explanation. This is a chart that I was able to get from the Loma Linda University Biblical Archive. And this is a copy of the original chart from back then, in 1843 chart. And it shows the Daniel vision of Nebuchadnezzar's statue. It shows the beasts and all of that, all those different parallel prophecies, and the dates. Now you'll notice when you look at the bottom of the chart that you see 1335. So we're not going to go into detail what's on this chart, but it is significant that his interpretation of these prophecies came up with 1335 in a couple of cases on this chart. Now here's an explanation about the chart. As early as 1842, the direction given in this prophecy to, quote, write the vision and make it plain upon tablets, that it may run, that he may run that readeth it, had suggested to Charles Fitch, which is the person who originally made the chart, the preparation of a prophetic chart to illustrate the visions of Daniel and Revelation. So Charles Fitch, who was a fellow preacher in the time of William Miller's movement, it had been suggested that he make a chart, and they felt it was a fulfillment of a Bible verse, a prophecy that said, write the vision, make it plain upon tablets, that he may run that readeth it. So Charles Fitch interpreted that, and others interpreted that someone should make a chart. So Charles Fitch did, and this is the chart. Great Controversy continues to explain, no one, however, then noticed that an apparent delay in the accomplishment of the vision, a tarrying time, is presented in the same prophecy. What's being referred to here is the date in the bottom row, 1843. So these different prophecy calculations kept coming up with 1843, and the Millerite movement originally thought 1843 was when Jesus was going to come. Now, that proved to not be the case, but then they realized that that was not taking into consideration that when you switch from AD to BC, there's, is there a 0 year or not? So they recalculated to 1844. So this chart was wrong from the start. Now, in 1850, this is after the Great Disappointment of 1844, and this is after many of the Millerite people gave up their faith. Many of them were setting new dates, and everything was getting broken into different factions. Some just gave up on God altogether. But in 1850, Ellen White was shown in a vision the need for a new chart.
It was completed in 1851 and published by the Seventh-day Adventist Church Publishing. Noticeable differences from the 1842 Fitch chart are the correction from 1843 to 1844. The sanctuary was included, as well as the three angels' messages, and Noticeably, for our particular study, the 1260, 1290, and 1335 days are not on this chart, as well as the 2520 was no longer on the chart. So when you compared the two charts, those are pretty significant differences. But the most important change was that the cross was made more prominent on this new chart because Jesus is the reason for all of it.
So the historical chart ended up, if I took the dates and the information from the chart that Uriah Smith in 1881, Charles Finch, and Apollos Hales came up with, and I just made it easier to understand. And I want to thank Tiffany Suma for making such a nice graphic from my primitive original interpretation of these charts. This chart takes went with the assumption that the 1260 years of the papal supremacy between 538 to 1798, which is true, but just because it's 1260 doesn't mean that the next 1260 is the same 1260. They assumed it was, so they started by applying what they already knew about the 1260-year prophecy and bringing it into this prophecy of Daniel 12. So they assumed that it started or ended at 1798 because that was the end of the 1260 years, 538 to 1798. 538 is when the French gave Rome the power, gave the Pope the power, and then the Pope was persecuting and strong during the 1260 years, and in 1798 the Pope was the deadly wound was healed, is the wording in Revelation, and they took him captive and he died in prison. The French did. So the French put him into power and then took him out. But the significance is it was 1260 years. Now we know that's true, but that doesn't mean it applies to the Daniel 1260 days. So anyway, back to this chart. This is what has been believed for a long, long time. In Adventist circles and historians, this seems to be the interpretation for the Daniel 1260. It puts it in the past. It converts the day in the prophecy to literal years, which is a valid thing to do if it applies. So now they had 538 to 1798. So then what do they do with the 1290? They said, well, let's go backwards. So they went backwards 1290 and came up with 508, and they said, what happened in 508 that we can tag this to? Well, Clovis was converted to Christianity. Oh, great. Well, that we'll use that one. Well, then they had the 1335. What are we going to do with that? Well, let's go from that and go forward. So they put the 1335, and lo and behold, it ended up with a familiar date, 1843. So they go, bingo, we understand this. This chart is what it ought to be. Well, there are some problems with this, even though it has some validity as a historical view. The most significant thing that I see wrong with it is that it's not the only possible interpretation, because when we look at the context of the book of Daniel, or chapter 12 in particular, it's all in the future. It's not in the past. So let's move forward. This is really interesting. Ellen White encountered a gentleman by the name of Brother Hewitt. This was in 1850. And he lived in Dead River, and this guy was claiming that Ellen White was Jezebel. So here is her letter. Brother Hewitt from Dead River was there. He came with a message to the effect that the destruction of the wicked and the sleep of the dead was an abomination with a shut door, within a shut door that woman Jezebel, a prophetess, had brought in, and he believed that I, Ellen White, was the woman Jezebel. So, here's the story. Ellen White hears of this guy named Brother Hewitt who was passing rumors around that Ellen White was a false prophet, and he still said she was a prophet, but he was saying she's a false prophet, and that some of the things that she had been promoting were errors, such as the destruction of the wicked at the end of the 1,000 years, which of course the Bible says it's going to happen, and the sleep of the dead instead of going to heaven when you die. So he's calling those two biblical theologies to be erroneous. They're an abomination, and they're the result of this Jezebel woman, Ellen White. So Ellen White continues in here explaining this. She says, we told him of some of his errors in the past. That of 1335 days were ended, and numerous errors of his. Now the good news of this story is when Ellen White confronted him, he realized that she wasn't a false prophet and that he repented of his bad behavior and became a strong force in God's work. So he was misguided, and then he saw the errors of his ways and turned around. But the significance of this to us is the fact that the only thing that Ellen White pointed out that was an error of his that's written down was the 1335 days were ended. Now, if you go back to our chart from back in 1881, which was 4 years before, this is all previous. So the 1335 days, supposedly, according to this chart, had ended in 1843. But in 1850, she said that Brother Hewitt was in error when he said the 1335 days had already ended. So that means this chart could not be a correct interpretation of the 1335 days of Daniel 12. So the question is, if, as Ellen White said, the 1335 days of Daniel 12 were not in the past, as Brother Hewitt claimed, then could there be further understanding revealed about the time prophecies of Daniel 12, which is the whole purpose of this sequence of part 7 through 15 of preparing for the time of trouble. We're trying to find out the answer. How long will the time of trouble be? So, what we've learned in the past is the principle of progressive revelation, as found in the Bible and Spirit of Prophecy. God reveals truth as it's needed. Sometimes he hides the truth from us until the right time. Review and Herald in 1890, Ellen White wrote, "The truth is an advancing truth, and we must walk in the increasing light." There's progressive revelation. We must be living faith. We must have living faith in our hearts and reach out for larger knowledge and more advanced light. Counsels to Writers and Editors, page 35. New light will ever be revealed on the Word of God to him who is in living connection with the Sun of Righteousness. Let no one come to the conclusion that there's no more truth to be revealed. The diligent, prayerful seeker of truth will find precious rays of light yet to shine forth from the Word of God. Many gems are yet scattered that are to be gathered together to become the property of the remnant people of God. So the question is, even if the historic view chart has some validity, what might be the problem with this being the only interpretation of the time prophecies of Daniel 12? I'd like to suggest the fact that the context of Daniel 12 puts it in the future and not in the past. So there has to be an end time application. Another question, why would it seem that the time prophecies of Daniel 12 would be applied at face value as they're worded? In other words, not day for a year, but when it says a day, it's a day. Now we know the day for a year fits some prophecies and it doesn't fit other ones. Day for a year fit the 1260 years because the math works. It doesn't work if it's a day, it works if it's a year. Same with the 2300 days. Jesus died in the middle of the week, which means 7 days, and it happened right on schedule. Everything in the 2300 day prophecy came through on schedule if you apply a day for a year. But just like we need to consider the context of Daniel 12, whether it is past or future, we also need to consider, would it work if it was day for a year, or should it be taken at face value? And I'd like to suggest that all of the vision of Daniel 10, 11, and 12 should be taken at face value, because everything else in it is literal. It's not symbolic like some of the prophecies in Revelation. So here's what we've learned. Examples of a day for a year. We've looked at some of those, like this one that I just mentioned. This is a day for a year because it's literally 2300 days. This prophecy in the middle of this, of Jesus being crucified in the middle of the week, would not work if it was a day for a day, because Jesus didn't die in the middle of a week. He died in the middle of a week of years. So 3.5 years from when he was baptized till he was crucified, 3.5 years from when he was crucified to when the stoning of Stephen. Same with this. This is day for a year. It fits. 538 plus 1260 years is 1798. We know from history books that is the time period when the Roman power was in power. When the Pope was persecuting Bible-believing Christians, you couldn't apply it to be 1260 days because it was literal years. So as we also have learned, there are examples of day for a year, but there's also examples of year for a year in prophecy. Like Elijah was shut up during the drought for a literal 3.5 years. Nebuchadnezzar's dream. He was prophesied that he was going to end up being in a field like a cow for 7 years. It wasn't a day for a year. It was literally 7 years. So the conclusion is, if a day in prophecy is not always fulfilled as a literal year, then can we understand what a prophetic time period in Daniel should be interpreted? And that is by the context. So if we look at the context of Daniel 12, like we learned before, Michael stands up, the time of trouble, God's people are delivered, the special resurrection. All four of those are in the future. They're not in the 1800s. They're not in, 538 to 1798. They're not there. This is all ahead of us. It's during Jacob's time of trouble. So the context tells us that it's going to be in the future. So the modern day Adventist Bible students, for the most part, that have rethought this prophecy of the 1260, 1290, and 1335 days, if they think outside the box and they're not looking backwards before our time to that Uriah Smith Finch chart, then they pretty much consistently are not applying day for a year, because it just plain wouldn't be practical. It would be way too long. So here is one Bible student's interpretation. Marion Barry. This was published in Marion's book in 1990. And you will notice that the first thing on the chart is the National Sunday Law, which of course is in Revelation 13:11. And the 1335, it jumps ahead 1335 days to the voice of God in Revelation 16:17. Then we leapfrog back, because the first Sunday law is a national Sunday law in the United States, and then the next Sunday law is universal, worldwide. So it's 60 days from that point in time, And then we jump forward the 1260 days, or literally 3.5 years. We talked about how many times you see 3.5 years in the Bible. And that jumps us forward to the death decree for those who don't accept the mark of the beast. And so then we take the 1290 from the Universal Sunday Law and it pushes it off the end of the chart there. So it is understood by Marion Barry that the chart starts with the National Sunday Law, and because there are 15 days consequently between the death decree and the voice of God and Babylon ends, that the 3.5 years are between the Universal Sunday Law and the death decree. So what might be a problem with these time prophecies not starting at the same point? Notice these are jumping around. It's almost a little bit confusing. So what could be a problem that might make this chart questionable? My personal opinion is, number one, on the right, I don't see an event at the end of the 1290 days. And secondly, it seems like these things ought to all start at the same time. Could be wrong, not being dogmatic, but to me, that's brings this particular interpretation into question. So now here's another one. My friend John Bartels. He's a missionary background, and he's done extensive study on this. And he even gave me the privilege to preview his book on this subject before it was printed. And I really appreciate his interpretation of this. And his book doesn't have the chart, but I made the chart and then had him tell me if I thought I interpreted what he said correctly. Now here's his view on this, and he's printed this book in 2019, so this is quite current thinking. So it starts with the Sunday Law, and the 1290 days goes from the Sunday Law till the 7 last plagues. Then the 1335 days goes from the Sunday Law to the deliverance of God's people. Now, we don't know the day or the hour of Jesus coming, but nor do we know when there's a Sunday Law, what date. So, in defense of this, in my opinion, this isn't necessarily the deliverance, isn't necessarily the second coming. It's when the Father announces the day and the hour of his coming. So, back to the chart. So we have then backwards the 1260 days from the deliverance brings you to the Sunday Law enforcement. So according to John's chart, the Sunday Law would come into play, but it wouldn't necessarily be enforced. And then that would be a 75-day period, kind of a probationary period, and then it would start to get intense more and more. So I appreciate John's chart here. The question is, what might be a problem with this chart not accounting for when the death decree is in the sequence? It seems to me like the death decree is such a significant event in end time prophecy that it ought to show up on this chart somewhere. And unless Sunday Law enforcement means death decree, I think there's some more study can go into this particular view. Okay, next one is Doug Batchelor from Amazing Facts. Now, I don't know what his current thinking is. I spoke with someone who worked with him for about a dozen years as an evangelist at Amazing Facts. And this chart is a modern rendition that I made, and Tiffany Sue made even nicer, based on a YouTube video of Doug Batchelor teaching a Sabbath school class when the quarterly subject was Daniel 12. So he came up with this chart as a suggestion. And like I say, I don't know what his current thinking is. He was not being emphatic about it. He was very careful to say that. Like he said, the jury's out on this. We're just stimulating thought. If you want to see his take on this, you're welcome to search. Just type in Doug Batchelor 1335. It'll take you right there. Okay, so, and my friend who was there a dozen years or more doing evangelism with him happened to be in the audience of that day when they recorded it. And when I presented this chart to my Sabbath school class, that evangelist was in my audience by my request. And he said, yes, that's, I was there when he said that. And he said, you would be amazed at how much communication Doug Batchelor got about this after he presented this as a possibility. So here we go. And the reason it says pre-2015 on the chart is because the video was before 2015. So the disclaimer is, I don't know what Doug Batchelor's current thinking is, whether he's revised this or not, but he has to be careful what he says because he has so many people that hang on his every word. Okay, so here's the chart. So they all start at the same time. That comforts me because that makes sense to me. They all start with the Sunday law. That makes sense to me because it seems to me the Sunday law is a really pivotal moment in time in this end time prophecy scenario. So all three of these, 1260, 1290, 1335, all start on his chart from the Sunday law. National Sunday law in its original benign, growing in intensity form. So the 1263.5 years takes you to the death decree. Now, think about this. The little time of trouble is when you can't buy or sell, when the mark of the beast is increasingly being pressured on you. The little time of trouble is when, or the Jacob's time of trouble is when you flee to the mountains for your life. So it seems logical that the second time of trouble is going to be short. I say less than a year, because Jesus said in Matthew 24, pray that your flight not be in the winter. And so why would he say that if it was going to be 3.5 years long? So I believe that the Jacob's time of trouble, the intense, worse than it's ever been time of trouble, when the plagues and the death decree and all that stuff's going on, is short. The Bible even says that it'll be cut short for righteousness, or basically the whole humanity would not make it. So it's really going to be intense. But previous to that is the little time of trouble, which logically would be a longer period of time from the Sunday law. And we've seen in this study many, many occasions where 3.5 years pops up on the radar. So this makes total sense to me that the time period between the initiation of the Sunday law until there's a death decree would be 3.5 years, or 1260 literal days. Then the 1290 jumps ahead, and that's when the 7 last plagues start and probation closes, the time of Jacob's time of trouble. So according to Doug Batchelor's chart, the Sunday law happens. 3.5 years later, there's a death decree, and 30 days later is the close of probation and the beginning of Jacob's time of trouble. Then the 1335 days goes from the Sunday law to the first resurrection. So that's my interpretation of Doug Batchelor's chart from back in 2015. What might be the problem with this chart? Take a look at the chart. When is the death decree in relation to the plagues? Notice in his chart, the death decree is before the plagues. So this, I believe, is an error, because we have reason to believe that the death decree happens during the plagues at about the second or third plague. Because what's going to happen is the plagues will start. Probation has already closed. Nobody's going to change their mind. Everybody's either accepted the mark of the beast or are sealed with God's seal for eternity. So there's going to be no more death. There's just going to be a lot of chaos, and God's going to be pouring down his 7 last plagues.
One of the references from the Spirit of Prophecy regarding the timing of the plagues as compared to the death decree is found in Last Day Events, page 245. I saw that the four angels who hold back the four winds until Christ's work is done in the sanctuary, and then will come the seven last plagues. These plagues enraged the wicked against the righteous. They thought that we had brought the judgments of God upon them, and if they could rid the earth of us, the plagues would then be stayed. A decree went forth to slay the saints, which caused them to cry day and night for deliverance. So you can see that the plagues start before the death decree and not the other way around. One of the references from the Spirit of Prophecy regarding the timing of the plagues as compared to the death decree is found in Last Day Events, page 245. I saw that the four angels who hold back the four winds until Christ's work is done in the sanctuary, and then will come the seven last plagues. These plagues enraged the wicked against the righteous. They thought that we had brought the judgments of God upon them, and if they could rid the earth of us, the plagues would then be stayed. A decree went forth to slay the saints, which caused them to cry day and night for deliverance. So you can see that the plagues start before the death decree and not the other way around. The first plague would be grievous sores, such as skin cancer. The second plague is the oceans turn to blood, and the third plague is the rivers turn to blood.
By now, there's no drinking water. How long can you live without water? So people are getting panicky. This is really bad. And then they notice that God's people are not being affected. They've got fresh water. They're doing fine. They're not being affected by the plagues. So it seems logical to me, as we find in some writings of the Spirit of Prophecy, that the death decree happens somewhere between the second and third plague, because they notice that God's people aren't being affected by the plagues. They blame it on them, and they say, if we get rid of them, then the plagues will go away. So they come up with the death decree. So that's the issue that I have with that chart. So I've modified that chart and propose this possible explanation for the chart. It's the same chart as Doug Batchelor, except you will notice 1260 days. We first start with the Sunday law. They all start there. 1260 days takes you to the close of probation. So that's little time, or Jake. That's the first time of trouble when you can't buy or sell. Is potentially 1260 days, 3.5 years long. And in the midst of it, it goes from a national Sunday law to an international Sunday law. But none of that time period has a death decree. Then when probation is closed, 1290 days, which makes it 30 days later, the plagues have started. They've been going for a month. We're now into the second and going to the third plague. And the wicked turn on the righteous and say, we've got to get rid of them by having a death decree. So the death decree, according to this interpretation on the chart, would be the end of 1290 days. And then the 1335 is when it's all over and God announces the day and the hour of his coming. I'm not being dogmatic any more than Doug Batchelor was being dogmatic, but I believe that this chart makes a lot of sense. Now, the disclaimer is no one knows. God will reveal it when we need to know. When will we need to know? Remember progressive revelation? When will we need to know? When we're in the middle of it. And I believe that when we see a national Sunday law, we're going to understand these things better. Why? because it's going to be an encouragement that God knew what he was doing and he will be with us through to the end. So why would God delay in revealing the meaning of a Bible prophecy? Because he wants to reveal it when it is relevant. We may not have to definitively know this prophecy until we're in the middle of it. And then it would be time to reveal it at a time when it's being fulfilled, so we can be right in the middle of the prophecy. So, for instance, let's look at this. You'll notice we have no dates. We don't know the start date. We don't know the end date. But we have all these relational numbers. But if now we had a national Sunday law, and God opened our understanding and said, this is the chart, this is how the prophecy is to be understood, we'd now have a start date. And it would be an encouragement, because we would know that we're not that far from God taking us home. So the conclusion is, we need to not be dogmatic about our understanding of an end time prophecy, any of them. But we do need to trust that God will give us the understanding we need when we need it and in his own time. Like Ellen White wrote to A.G. Daniels and Prescott in 1903, let us read and understand the 12th chapter of Daniel. It's a warning that we'll all need to understand before the time of the end. Psalms 46:1 says, God, an ever-present help in times of trouble. 1 Samuel 12:22, for the Lord will not forsake his people for his great name's sake, because it hath pleased the Lord to make you his people. Psalms 23:39 and 40, but the salvation of the righteous is of the Lord. He is our strength in time of trouble. The Lord shall help us and deliver them. He will deliver them from the wicked and save them because they trust him. So the question for us today is, why do you think the books of Daniel and Revelation end with the second coming of Jesus? I'd like to suggest it's because that's what this is all about. That's the main point. Jesus is the one that gave the prophecies. It's about him, and it's an encouragement to us that he's in control and he's coming again. Personal reflection, now is the time when we should spend time with Jesus and grow our relationship together to be able to trust him when the difficult times come in our life and when we are faced with the time of trouble.